Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of man who solved problems with his fists before his brain caught up. At 28, his knuckles told stories of bar fights, street confrontations, and a temper that burned hotter than summer asphalt. Standing 6 feet 2 inches with shoulders that filled doorways, he carried himself like someone who had never backed down from anything in his life. The night that would change everything started like any other Tuesday in downtown Detroit. Marcus had been drinking at Murphy's Tavern, a dive bar where the beer was cheap and the conversations were cheaper. His construction job had ended 3 weeks ago, and unemployment checks barely covered his rent in the rundown apartment above the Chinese restaurant. The smell of fried rice and desperation had become his daily cologne. Sarah, his girlfriend of 2 years, had left him a voicemail earlier that day. Her voice cracked through the static of his old phone, explaining she couldn't handle his drinking anymore. Couldn't handle the way his hands turned into hammers when he was angry. She was staying with her sister in Cleveland and wouldn't be coming back. The message played on repeat in his head as he downed his 5th whiskey. "Another round, Marcus?" asked Jimmy, the bartender who had known him since high school. Jimmy's face carried the weathered look of someone who had served drinks to broken men for 30 years. Marcus nodded, sliding his empty glass across the scarred wooden bar. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it was nothing compared to the fire in his chest. Around him, the usual crowd of lost souls nursed their own problems. Old Pete mumbled about his dead wife, while Tony complained about his kids who never called. The television mounted in the corner flickered with late-night news. A reporter stood outside Riverside Community Bank, explaining how it had been robbed 3 times in the past year. The security guard had been hospitalized twice, and the bank was considering closing permanently. Marcus barely paid attention until the reporter mentioned the guard's name, Robert Chen, age 55, father of 3 daughters. Something stirred in Marcus's alcohol-soaked brain. Robert Chen. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it through the whiskey fog. He shrugged it off and focused on his drink, watching the ice cubes melt like tiny glaciers in an ocean of bourbon. At closing time, Marcus stumbled out into the cold November air. The streets were empty except for a few homeless people huddled near steam vents. His breath formed clouds as he walked the 6 blocks to his apartment, his heavy work boots echoing off the silent buildings. 2 days later, Marcus found himself standing outside the same Riverside Community Bank, but not for any noble reason. His landlord had given him an ultimatum: pay the 3 months of back rent or get evicted. His unemployment had run out and desperation had begun whispering dark suggestions in his ear. The bank sat on the corner like a brick fortress, its windows reflecting the gray Detroit sky. Marcus had walked past it dozens of times over the years, never really seeing it. But now he studied it like a blueprint, noting the single security guard, the older customers who moved slowly, the predictable patterns of daily life. He told himself he just needed enough to get back on his feet. Maybe $1,000, enough to pay rent and buy some time to find another job. He wasn't a career criminal, just a desperate man making desperate choices. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, but the whiskey and desperation had formed an alliance that drowned out reason. Marcus spent the next week watching the bank, learning its rhythms like a predator studying prey. The security guard always arrived at 8:30 sharp, a thin Asian man who moved with the careful precision of someone who took his job seriously. He carried himself with quiet dignity, greeting customers with respectful nods and maintaining order without swagger or intimidation. On Friday afternoon, Marcus made his decision. He had pawned everything of value, including his father's watch and Sarah's engagement ring that she had left behind. The $40 he got wouldn't even buy groceries for a week. His stomach had been empty for 2 days, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He walked into Murphy's Tavern and ordered 3 shots of the cheapest whiskey. Dutch courage, his father used to call it, though his father had been too much of a coward to face his own demons without a bottle. Marcus knocked back the shots and felt the familiar fire spread through his veins, burning away the last of his hesitation. The plan was simple because Marcus was not a complex man. Walk into the bank, demand money, and walk out. He had no gun, no elaborate scheme, just his fists and the desperation that comes from having nothing left to lose. He figured the sight of a man his size making demands would be enough to open the cash drawer. As he walked toward the bank, his reflection caught in store windows showed a man transformed by necessity into something he barely recognized. His jaw was set in grim determination, his hands clenched into fists that had solved every problem in his life since childhood. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows that seemed to point toward his destination like dark arrows of fate. The bank's glass doors reflected his approach, and for a moment Marcus saw himself clearly, a desperate man about to cross a line he could never uncross. But hunger and eviction notices had a way of making moral boundaries seem like luxuries for people with choices. He pushed through the doors into the quiet, carpeted world of financial transactions and customer service smiles. The air conditioning carried the smell of fresh paper and floor polish. 3 customers stood in line at the single-teller window, while others sat at desks discussing loans and account details. The security guard stood near the entrance, his back to Marcus as he helped an elderly woman who had dropped her purse. The guard's uniform was pressed and neat, his posture straight despite his age. Something about the careful way he helped gather the woman's scattered belongings suggested a man who genuinely cared about others. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he approached. This was it, the moment that would either solve his problems or create much bigger ones. He raised his fist, focusing all his desperation and anger into the punch that would knock out the only obstacle between him and the money he needed to survive. The punch landed with devastating precision. Marcus's right fist connected with the side of the guard's head, sending him crashing into the marble wall with a sickening thud. The elderly woman screamed and stumbled backward, her purse scattering contents across the polished floor. The security guard crumpled like a broken doll, his head striking the ground with another terrible sound that echoed through the suddenly silent bank. Marcus stood frozen, his knuckles already beginning to swell. The punch had been perfect, the kind that ended bar fights in seconds. But as he looked down at the unconscious man sprawled at his feet, something cold and sharp twisted in his stomach. This wasn't some drunk construction worker looking for trouble. This was just an older man doing his job, trying to help people. "Everyone stay calm," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with uncertainty. The 3 customers in line pressed themselves against the far wall, eyes wide with terror. The bank teller, a young woman with blonde hair and glasses, stood paralyzed, behind the bulletproof glass, her hand hovering over what Marcus assumed was a silent alarm. Blood pooled beneath the guard's head, dark red against the white marble. His breathing was shallow but steady, and Marcus felt a wave of relief that he hadn't killed the man. At least not yet. The guard's name tag read R. Chen, and seeing it made Marcus's stomach lurch for reasons he couldn't understand. "Open the cash drawer," Marcus demanded, approaching the teller window. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and desperate. The young woman, her name tag said Jessica, stared at him with tears streaming down her face. I can't," she stammered. "The manager has to authorize large withdrawals and he's at lunch." Marcus slammed his fist against the glass, causing Jessica to flinch backward. "I don't want a withdrawal. Just open the drawer and give me what's in there." But even as he made his demands, Marcus found himself looking back at the fallen guard. The man was older than he had appeared from a distance, probably in his mid-50s, with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes. His wedding ring caught the fluorescent light, and Marcus noticed a small photograph that had fallen from the man's shirt pocket. 3 young women in graduation gowns, all with the same kind eyes as the man bleeding on the floor. "Please," Jessica whispered, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the cash drawer. "Please don't hurt anyone else." The words hit Marcus like ice water. Anyone else. As if he was some kind of monster who went around hurting innocent people for fun. But wasn't that exactly what he had just done? He had attacked a man whose only crime was standing between him and money that wasn't his. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had triggered the alarm after all. Marcus had maybe 3 minutes before the police arrived. 3 minutes to grab whatever money he could and disappear into the maze of downtown Detroit. He should have been focused on escape, on survival, on the practical matters of not getting caught. Instead, he found himself kneeling beside the unconscious guard. Up close, he could see the man's face clearly, and recognition hit him like a physical blow. This was Robert Chen, the same guard mentioned on the news, the one who had been hospitalized twice already from previous robberies. the father of 3 daughters whose graduation photo now lay crumpled on the blood-stained floor. Marcus's hands shook as he gently turned Robert's head to examine the wound. There was a lot of blood, but head wounds always bled heavily. The real concern was the possibility of brain injury from hitting the wall and then the floor. Robert's pulse was weak but regular under Marcus's fingers, and his breathing seemed to be getting stronger. "Is he going to be okay?" Jessica asked from behind the glass, her voice small and frightened. Marcus looked up at her, seeing his own reflection in the bulletproof barrier. His face was pale and drawn, nothing like the confident, tough guy who had walked into the bank 5 minutes ago. "I think so," he said quietly, "but he needs an ambulance." "They're coming," Jessica said. "The police and paramedics are both coming." The sirens were much closer now, maybe 2 blocks away. Marcus should have been running, should have grabbed whatever money he could carry and headed for the back exit, but he couldn't seem to move away from Robert Chen's still form. The man's breathing hitched and Marcus instinctively supported his head, trying to keep his airway clear. "Why did you do this?" Jessica asked, and Marcus heard genuine confusion in her voice rather than accusation. "You don't look like, you seem like." "Like what?" Marcus asked bitterly. "Like a decent person? I used to think I was." He touched the photograph of Robert's daughters with one finger. "These his kids?" Jessica nodded. "He talks about them all the time. Amy just started medical school. Linda's getting married next month, and Jenny just had a baby. His first grandchild." Each detail was another knife twist in Marcus's chest. This wasn't some faceless security guard. This was a grandfather, a father, who bragged about his daughter's accomplishments and probably carried baby pictures in his wallet. A man whose family depended on him coming home safe every night. "He's been working extra shifts to pay for the wedding," Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger. "He shows everyone the pictures of the dress Linda picked out. It's beautiful. White satin with tiny pearls." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of what he had done. He had attacked a grandfather saving money for his daughter's wedding, a man who had already survived 2 other robberies and kept coming to work because his family needed him. The money Marcus had been so desperate to steal probably represented weeks of overtime and sacrifice. The sirens stopped directly outside, followed by the sound of car doors slamming. Heavy footsteps approached the bank entrance, and Marcus knew his time had run out. In moments, police officers would storm through those doors with guns drawn, ready to arrest or possibly shoot the violent criminal who had assaulted an innocent security guard. Robert Chen's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. He tried to sit up, and Marcus gently pressed him back down. "Stay still," Marcus said softly. "You hit your head pretty hard." Robert's gaze found Marcus's face, and there should have been fear there, or anger, or hatred. Instead, Marcus saw only concern and confusion. "Are you hurt?" Robert asked weakly, his voice barely a whisper. The question shattered something inside Marcus's chest. Even semi-conscious and bleeding, this man's first instinct was to worry about others. Marcus had knocked him senseless, and Robert Chen was asking if his attacker was injured. "No," Marcus managed to say. "I'm fine. You're the one who got hurt." Police voices echoed outside the glass doors, sharp and commanding. They were setting up a perimeter, calling for backup, preparing to deal with what they assumed was an armed and dangerous robbery in progress. Marcus had maybe 30 seconds before they breached the entrance. He looked down at Robert Chen, at Jessica cowering behind bulletproof glass, at the elderly woman who was still pressed against the far wall clutching her chest. He thought about Sarah's voicemail, about his empty apartment and unpaid bills, about all the choices that had led him to this moment. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone in that bank, including himself. Marcus stood up slowly, raising his hands above his head. The police voices outside were getting more organized, more urgent. Through the glass doors, he could see officers taking positions behind their squad cars, weapons drawn and ready. The situation was escalating quickly toward violence, and Marcus knew that any sudden movement could result in gunfire. "I'm coming out," he shouted toward the entrance. "I'm unarmed and surrendering." Jessica stared at him in shock from behind the bulletproof glass. The elderly woman against the wall looked confused, as if she couldn't understand why a bank robber would give himself up. Even Robert Chen, still lying on the floor with blood matting his gray hair, watched Marcus with a puzzled expression. "Why?" Robert asked quietly, his voice stronger now but still shaky. "You could have run out the back. There's an emergency exit through the break room." Marcus looked down at him, at this man he had brutalized for no reason other than his own desperation. "Because what I did to you was wrong," he said simply. "Running away won't change that." The front doors burst open and 4 police officers flooded into the bank with military precision. Their weapons were trained on Marcus, red laser dots dancing across his chest like deadly fireflies. The lead officer, a stern woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, kept her gun steady as she approached. "Get on the ground. Now," she commanded. Marcus complied immediately, lowering himself to his knees and then lying flat on the cold marble floor. The surface was still slick with Robert's blood, and Marcus felt it seep through his shirt. The metallic smell filled his nostrils as officers swarmed around him, their heavy boots echoing in the sudden silence. Cold handcuffs bit into his wrists as they pulled his arms behind his back. The officer's knee pressed into his spine while another cop searched his pockets, finding nothing more dangerous than his wallet and keys. They were professional but not gentle, treating him like the violent criminal he had proven himself to be. "Are there any other perpetrators?" the lead officer asked, her weapon still drawn even though Marcus was clearly restrained. "No," Marcus said into the floor. "Just me. And I didn't have a weapon." Paramedics rushed in with a gurney and medical equipment, immediately surrounding Robert Chen. Marcus watched from his prone position as they checked his vital signs, examined the head wound, and prepared to transport him to the hospital. Robert was conscious and alert, answering their questions coherently, which seemed like a good sign. "Sir, can you tell us what happened?" one of the paramedics asked Robert as they fitted a neck brace around him as a precaution. Robert looked across the floor at Marcus, their eyes meeting for a long moment. Marcus expected to see hatred there, or at least anger. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like sadness, as if Robert was disappointed rather than furious. "He hit me," Robert said quietly. "But then he stayed to help me." He could have left, but he stayed. The police officers exchanged glances. Bank robbers who stayed to provide first aid to their victims weren't exactly common. The lead officer, whose name tag read Lieutenant Rodriguez, crouched down beside Marcus. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus Thompson," he replied honestly. There was no point in lying now. "Why did you do this, Marcus? You obviously know it was wrong, or you wouldn't have surrendered. So what made you think robbing a bank was a good idea?" Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "I was desperate," he said. "Lost my job, lost my girlfriend, about to be evicted. I thought I could just grab some money and solve my problems." He opened his eyes and looked at Robert being loaded onto the gurney. "I didn't think about who I might hurt." Lieutenant Rodriguez stood up as the paramedics wheeled Robert toward the exit. The injured guard raised one hand weakly toward Marcus as they passed, not in anger or accusation, but in what looked almost like forgiveness. The gesture hit Marcus harder than any punch he had ever taken. "The victim wants to know if you'll be okay," one of the paramedics called over as they reached the doors. Marcus felt his throat close up. Even after being assaulted, Robert Chen was worried about his attacker's well-being. It was such a profound act of grace that Marcus couldn't find words to respond. He just nodded, not trusting his voice. After the ambulance left, the police helped Marcus to his feet and began the process of booking him. Lieutenant Rodriguez read him his rights while other officers interviewed the witnesses. Jessica, the young teller, seemed eager to tell them how Marcus had surrendered voluntarily and tried to help the injured guard. "That's unusual," Rodriguez admitted as they walked toward the patrol car. "Most bank robbers don't stick around to play medic." "I'm not a bank robber," Marcus said, then immediately realized how stupid that sounded. "I mean, I tried to be one, but I'm not cut out for it. I couldn't even get the money before I realized what a terrible thing I was doing." Rodriguez opened the back door of the squad car. "Well, you're going to have plenty of time to think about what kind of person you want to be," she said, not unkindly. Assault and attempted robbery are serious charges. As they drove to the police station, Marcus stared out the window at the familiar streets of Detroit. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago, but he felt fundamentally changed. The desperation that had driven him to violence was still there. He was still unemployed, still facing eviction, still alone. But something had shifted inside him when he saw Robert Chen's daughters in that graduation photo. When he heard about the wedding dress with tiny pearls. The police station was a blur of paperwork, fingerprints, and mugshots. Marcus answered every question honestly, providing a detailed account of his actions without making excuses or trying to minimize his guilt. The detective handling his case seemed surprised by his cooperation. Most people try to downplay what they did, Detective Williams observed as he reviewed Marcus's statement. You're practically writing your own conviction. I did what I did, Marcus replied. Lying about it won't change anything. They placed him in a holding cell with 2 other men, one arrested for drunk driving, the other for shoplifting. Marcus sat on the thin mattress and stared at the concrete wall, replaying every moment of the past few hours. The sound of his fist connecting with Robert's head echoed in his memory, along with the sight of blood on pristine marble and a photograph of 3 smiling daughters. Hours passed before his court-appointed lawyer arrived. Maria Santos was a tired-looking woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She reviewed his case file with professional efficiency, occasionally glancing up at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. You're looking at serious time, she said finally. Assault with injury and attempted robbery. The prosecutor will probably offer a plea deal, but even with your cooperation and lack of criminal history, you're talking about at least 2 to 3 years in state prison. Marcus nodded. He had expected as much. What about the guard? Robert Chen? How is he? Maria consulted her notes. He's stable. Concussion and some stitches, but the doctors expect a full recovery. He should be released tomorrow. She looked up at him curiously. He actually asked the prosecutor to go easy on you. Said you showed remorse and tried to help him. The news should have been encouraging, but it only made Marcus feel worse. Robert Chen was advocating for mercy toward the man who had put him in the hospital. It was another act of incomprehensible grace that Marcus felt completely unworthy to receive. That night, lying on the narrow jail cot, Marcus stared at the ceiling and thought about the moment everything had changed. It wasn't when he decided to rob the bank or when he threw the punch or even when he surrendered to police. It was when Robert Chen opened his eyes and asked if his attacker was hurt. In that instant, Marcus had seen himself through different eyes, not as a desperate man driven to crime by circumstances, but as someone who had chosen to hurt another person. The distinction seemed important, though he couldn't quite articulate why. 3 weeks into his jail stay while awaiting sentencing, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. The guard at the detention center looked puzzled as he escorted Marcus to the visitor room, shaking his head with confusion. Strangest thing I've seen in 20 years, the guard muttered. Victim coming to visit the guy who put him in the hospital? Marcus's heart hammered as he walked into the small room with its plastic chairs and scratched table. Robert Chen sat waiting for him, a small bandage still visible at his hairline and a slight discoloration around his left eye. He looked smaller in civilian clothes, more fragile than he had in his security uniform. They sat across from each other in awkward silence for several minutes. Marcus couldn't bring himself to make eye contact, staring instead at his hands folded on the metal table. Those same hands had caused the injuries he could still see on Robert's face. How are you feeling? Robert asked finally, his voice gentle. The question was so unexpected that Marcus looked up despite himself. How am I feeling? You're the one who got hurt. Robert smiled slightly, wincing as the expression pulled at a tender spot near his temple. I'm healing fine. The doctors say I can go back to work next week. But I've been worried about you. Worried about me? Marcus felt like the conversation was happening in some alternate reality, where victims worried about their attackers. Why would you be worried about me? Robert leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table mirror fashion to Marcus's. Because I've seen a lot of desperate people in my line of work, and most of them don't surrender when they could escape. Most of them don't stay to help the person they hurt. He paused, studying Marcus's face. You're not a criminal, are you? This was your first time doing anything like this. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. The kindness in Robert's eyes was almost unbearable. I thought so, Robert continued. I could tell by how you looked when you realized what you'd done. Like it surprised you as much as it surprised everyone else. It did, Marcus admitted quietly. I never thought I could hurt someone like that. I mean, I've been in fights before, but always with other guys looking for trouble. You were just doing your job, helping that old lady, and I... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. You were desperate, Robert said simply, Desperation makes people do things they never imagined they could do. I understand that better than you might think. Marcus looked at him curiously and Robert continued. 15 years ago, my family was struggling badly. My wife was sick with cancer. The medical bills were crushing us, and I was working 3 jobs just to keep our heads above water. The girls were young then, and they didn't understand why Daddy was never home, why Mommy was always tired, why we couldn't afford the things their friends had. Robert's voice grew distant, remembering. One night, walking home from my midnight security shift, I passed a house where the family had clearly forgotten to lock their car. Keys in the ignition, wallet visible on the dashboard. I stood there for 10 minutes, telling myself I could solve all our problems with one quick decision. Marcus leaned forward, captivated despite himself. What stopped you? Amy, Robert said, smiling at the memory. My oldest daughter. She was 7 then, and she had this habit of waiting up for me no matter how late I worked. That night, she had drawn me a picture of our family, with stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. At the bottom, in her careful printing, she had written, "My daddy is a hero." Robert's eyes grew moist. I realized that if I took those keys, if I stole that wallet, I wouldn't be her hero anymore. I'd be something else entirely, and she would have to live with that shame. So I walked away and we found other solutions to our problems. It took longer, we struggled more, but we did it without compromising who we were. Marcus absorbed this story, trying to process the idea that Robert had once stood where he had stood, facing the same crushing desperation and temptation. But you had your daughter's drawing to remind you who you were. I don't have anything like that. No one thinks I'm a hero. Robert reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully and slid it across the table to Marcus. It was the graduation photo that had fallen from Robert's pocket during the assault. But now Marcus could see the inscription on the back in careful handwriting. To Dad, thank you for always showing us what integrity looks like. We love you. Amy, Linda, and Jenny. They wrote this after Amy graduated from college, Robert explained. She's in medical school now. Linda's getting married next month, and Jenny just made me a grandfather. They all turned out to be good people, and part of that is because they saw their father make the right choices even when they were difficult. Marcus stared at the photograph, at the 3 young women with their father's kind eyes and proud smiles. Why are you showing me this? Because I don't think you're a bad person, Marcus. I think you're a good person who made a bad choice. There's a difference, and that difference matters for what happens next. Robert pulled out another item from his pocket, a business card with his name and phone number written on the back. I've been talking to my supervisor at the bank about you. They're not pressing for the maximum sentence, partly because of how you behaved after the assault. Your lawyer says you might get out in 18 months with good behavior. Marcus took the card but didn't understand its significance. What does this mean? It means when you get out, you'll need a job, and I know someone who might be willing to give you a chance. Robert smiled, and this time it didn't seem to cause him pain. The bank is expanding their security staff. The pay isn't great, but it's honest work, and sometimes that's more important than the money. Marcus felt tears building behind his eyes. You want to help me get a job? After what I did to you? What you did was wrong, Robert said firmly. But what you did afterward showed character. You chose to face the consequences instead of running. You tried to help me when you could have been thinking only of yourself. Those choices tell me something about who you really are. They sat in silence for several minutes while Marcus processed this unexpected turn. The man he had assaulted was offering him employment and a second chance at life. It seemed too generous to be real, too forgiving to accept. I don't deserve this, Marcus said finally. Deserve has nothing to do with it, Robert replied. We don't get what we deserve in this life. If we did, I'd probably be dead from cancer stress 15 years ago. And my daughters wouldn't have their father to walk them down the aisle or bounce their babies on his knee. Sometimes we get mercy instead of justice, and when that happens, the only appropriate response is to pass that mercy on to someone else. Robert stood to leave, then paused at the door. I want you to think about something while you're in here, Marcus. You said no one thinks you're a hero, but that's not entirely true. That young teller, Jessica, told the police you could have hurt her or the other customers, but you didn't. You only hurt the person standing in your way, and then you immediately regretted it. In her eyes, you're not a complete villain. After Robert left, Marcus sat alone in the visitor room for a long time, Holding the business card and staring at the photo of 3 daughters who had grown up believing their father was a hero, he thought about Amy's childhood drawing with its rainbow and stick figures, about Linda's wedding dress with tiny pearls, about Jenny's new baby who would grow up knowing grandfather Robert as a man of integrity. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus began to imagine a different future for himself. Not the future he had planned before his desperate act, but something entirely new. A future where he might become the kind of person others could respect, maybe even look up to. It would require serving his time with dignity, rebuilding his life from nothing, and proving himself worthy of Robert Chen's inexplicable faith in him. But sitting in that visitor room, holding evidence of one man's extraordinary capacity for forgiveness, Marcus began to believe it might be possible. 14 months later, Marcus Thompson walked out of Riverside Correctional Facility carrying a small cardboard box containing everything he owned in the world. The box held 3 books Robert had sent him. Letters from his sister in Phoenix who had reconnected after hearing about his imprisonment, and a worn photograph of 3 young women in graduation gowns. The morning air tasted different as a free man, sharper and full of possibilities that had seemed impossible behind bars. Marcus had used his time wisely, earning his GED and completing a vocational training program in building maintenance. More importantly, he had attended every anger management session and addiction counseling meeting available, determined to understand the man who had been capable of such violence. Robert Chen waited in the parking lot, leaning against a modest sedan with a patient smile on his face. He looked older than Marcus remembered, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes. But his handshake was firm, and his greeting was warm. "Ready for a new chapter?" Robert asked as they drove toward downtown Detroit. Marcus nodded, though anxiety churned in his stomach. The world had continued without him, and he wondered how much had changed. "How's your family? Linda got married, right?" 3 months ago, Robert beamed, pulling out his phone to show pictures at a red light. "Beautiful ceremony. Jenny's baby is walking now, getting into everything, and Amy just started her residency at Detroit General." The pride in Robert's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus felt a familiar pang of something he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy exactly, but a deep longing for the kind of connection Robert had with his daughters. Marcus's own family had fallen apart years ago, scattered by addiction and disappointment. They drove through familiar neighborhoods that looked different somehow, gentrified in some areas, more rundown in others. The Chinese restaurant below Marcus's old apartment had closed, replaced by a trendy coffee shop with expensive-looking customers sitting at sidewalk tables. "There's something we need to discuss before you start work," Robert said as they pulled into the bank parking lot. "Not everyone is comfortable with this arrangement. Some of the other employees know what happened, and they're not all as forgiving as I am." Marcus had expected this. "I understand. I can find something else if it's going to cause problems." "No," Robert said firmly. "You earned this chance, and I believe you've changed. But you'll need to prove it to others, and that might take time." The bank looked exactly the same from the outside, but walking through those glass doors felt surreal. The marble floors had been cleaned so thoroughly that no trace of blood remained, but Marcus could still see the spot where Robert had fallen. His hand shook slightly as they approached the security office. "Marcus Thompson, meet David Sullivan," Robert said, introducing him to a younger security guard with suspicious eyes and crossed arms. "David's been covering my shifts when needed, and he'll be training you on the new protocols." David's handshake was perfunctory, his expression skeptical. "So you're the guy who knocked out Robert," he said without preamble. "Yes," Marcus replied quietly. "There was no point in dodging the truth, and now you want to be a security guard yourself. Seems ironic."